Every day for 50 years, people drove past a barn outside Drew, Mississippi, and said nothing. Not because they didn't know, they knew. The black community in and around Drew had always known, had passed the knowledge from parent to child. The way you pass down a name, or a prayer, or a warning. When Gloria Dickerson was growing up in Drew, her mother would slow the car when they reached that stretch of road and turn to her daughter and say quietly, matter-of-factly, the way you say something you want your child to carry. That is where they killed Emmett Till. No plaque, no marker, no official record. Just a weathered barn on a flat delta road sitting in plain sight. Its wood going gray in the Mississippi sun with nothing on its walls to tell anyone who drove past what had happened inside. The world thought it knew where Emmett Till was killed. The world had been told it was the riverbank that Bryant and Milam had driven him to the Tallahatchie and done what they did there. That was the story in the 1956 Look magazine article. That was the story in the books and the documentaries and the classroom lessons in all the places the case was taught and examined and mourned. The riverbank, the water, the cotton gin fan tied around his neck with barbed wire. But the people of Drew knew the truth had a different address. And for 50 years, through investigations and grand juries and congressional hearings and civil rights legislation passed in Emmett Till's name, that address stayed in the community's memory and out of the official record. This is not a story about who killed Emmett Till. That has been known since 1955. This is a story about a barn. About what it means for a community to hold a truth that the world is not ready to receive. About the distance between knowing and saying, and what fills that distance and what it costs, and whether it can ever be fully crossed. Drew, Mississippi sits in the flat cotton country of the Delta. A few miles from Money, a few miles from Ruleville in Sunflower County. The kind of geography that in 1955 meant one thing above almost everything else: who owned the land and who worked it. J.W. Milam owned land outside Drew. He was 36 years old in the summer of 1955, a veteran broad-shouldered and physically imposing in the way that men who have never been told no tend to carry themselves. He owned a seed barn on his property and employed black sharecroppers to work his fields, men and their families who lived in the particular dependency of tenant farming in the Mississippi Delta, where what you owed at the end of the season was often more than what you earned, and where the person you owed it to was also the person who could put you off your land, or call his friends in the county, or do worse things that also went unreported. This was the world that surrounded the barn. Not a world of strangers and random violence, but a world of known relationships and deliberate power. A world where the people who worked Milam's land knew his name and his temper, and the specific gravity of his authority over their lives. On the morning of August 28, 1955, Milam and his half-brother Roy Bryant drove a green pickup truck from Money to Drew with Emmett Till in the back. They had taken the boy from his great-uncle's house at 2 in the morning. They drove through the pre-dawn dark of the Delta, and somewhere along the way they stopped at the barn. What happened inside that barn is not in dispute among those who investigated it carefully. Emmett Till was beaten there. He was shot there. What is in dispute, what has always been in dispute, is exactly who else was present, and whether the men who owned that land and worked it that day are still alive, and whether they will ever be named. On the road outside the barn that morning, a young man named Willie Reed was walking. Willie Reed was 18 years old. He worked as a sharecropper in the fields around Drew. The same fields that surrounded the barn, doing the work that young men in his position did in Sunflower County in 1955, not because it was what he wanted, but because it was what was available, and because the alternatives were limited in ways that required no explanation to anyone who understood where and when he was born. He was walking on the road near the barn when a truck turned in. He recognized J.W. Millam in the cab. He saw men in the back of the truck. He stopped. He did not know who the boy in the back was, but he could see that something was wrong. He hid near the barn, and he waited. And then he heard it. What Willie Reed heard from outside that barn on the morning of August 28th, 1955, the sounds that came through the walls and carried in the still Delta air he described in the only way he could in a courtroom in Sumner, Mississippi. 3 weeks later, I heard licks. I heard somebody hollering. He stood outside and listened to a 14-year-old boy crying out inside a barn on a hot August morning, and he knew what it was, and he could not stop it. He went home. He told a neighbor, an older woman named Amanda Bradley, who had worked that land for years. She went back to the barn with him. They walked to a well near the entrance, and Millam came out and asked them if they had heard anything. They said no. Willie Reed went home and stayed inside. His family and neighbors gathered around him. Everyone who knew what he had seen and heard told him the same thing in various forms, with varying degrees of urgency: do not say anything. They were not telling him this because they did not care what had happened to that boy. They were telling him because they knew Mississippi. They knew what happened to black men and women in Sunflower County who stood up in a courtroom and accused white men of crimes. They knew the county. They knew Millam. They knew what had happened to others who had spoken when speaking was dangerous. Willie Reed listened to all of them, and then he did something that almost no one in his position in that county in that year could have done. He decided to testify anyway. He walked into the Tallahatchie County Courthouse in Sumner, Mississippi, and he took the stand and he told what he had seen and heard. He was the second black witness at that trial after Moses Wright Emmett's great-uncle, who had also testified, knowing what it could cost him. Willie Reed pointed at J.W. Millam, the man who had employed people like him his whole life, the man whose land he had worked, and he said what he knew. After the verdict, after the all-white jury acquitted Bryant and Millam in 67 minutes, Willie Reed left Mississippi that night. He moved to Chicago. He changed the details of his life quietly, the way people do when they understand that visibility is a form of danger. He lived for decades in the city carrying what he had heard in that barn, carrying what it had cost him to say it, carrying the knowledge that saying it had not been enough. He suffered from anxiety and depression for the rest of his life. His doctors connected it to the trauma of what he had witnessed and what doing the right thing had cost him. He died in Chicago in 2013 at the age of 76. He never went back to Mississippi. I think about Willie Reed often when I think about this story. Not because he is its most famous figure, he isn't, but because he represents something the story needs a person to carry. He was the person who heard the truth, who went toward it instead of away from it, who stood in front of a hostile courtroom in a hostile county in 1955 and said what he knew out loud, and who paid for it with the rest of a life shaped entirely by what that choice had cost. He was 18 years old. He was a sharecropper. He had no protection behind him, no organization, no guarantee of anything beyond the knowledge that if he said nothing, the men who had killed Emmett Till would walk free and would know that he had been there and stayed silent. He chose to speak. And speaking removed him from everything he had known, his land, his county, his community, his sense of a future connected to the place where he had been born. That is what the barn asked of the people closest to it. Not silence, that was what the system demanded. The barn itself asked something harder, whether you were willing to say what you knew, even when the cost of saying it was everything you had. Willie Reed said yes. He was one of the few who did. The rest of his life was the answer to what saying yes in Mississippi in 1955 actually meant. In January 1956, Look magazine published the confessions of Roy Bryant and J.W. Milam. It was one of the most remarkable documents in American journalism. Two men who had just been acquitted of murder, protected by double jeopardy, selling the story of how they had done it to a national magazine for $4,000. They described the abduction, the drive, the violence, the weighted body in the river. They were detailed and they were unapologetic. But there was one thing the article did not describe accurately. Before Look could publish, the magazine's editors required signed consent from every person whose involvement was described. One of those people was the owner of the barn outside Drew, a man who, unlike Bryant and Milam, had not been tried and acquitted, and therefore could still face legal consequences if his role became publicly known. He refused to sign unless the location of the killing was changed. The journalist William Bradford Huey changed it. He moved the murder to the riverbank of the Tallahatchie. The article went to press with the wrong address. That single editorial decision, made to protect a man who was never charged, removed the barn from the official story of Emmett Till's murder for 50 years. Every investigation that followed used the Look article as a baseline. The FBI in 1955, the state investigations, the books and documentaries and scholarly analyses. Everyone was looking at a river when the truth was in a barn 8 miles away. The people of Drew knew this. They had always known it. The barn sat on a road they drove, in a landscape they worked, in a county they had lived in for generations. You cannot hide a building from the people who live beside it. What you can do is make sure they understand the cost of speaking. The White Citizens Council was active in Sunflower County in 1955. The Klan was present in the Delta. The mechanisms of racial terror that had operated in Mississippi for generations did not stop operating after the Emmett Till trial. If anything, the acquittal confirmed what those mechanisms were designed to confirm, that the official structures of law and order would protect the people who used terror to maintain the social order. That speaking the truth about what had happened in that barn was not a protected act. That it was a dangerous one. So the community held the knowledge, passed it down, kept it in the only place it was safe in memory and private, in the careful transfer from mother to child on a road in Drew, Mississippi, when the barn came into view. Think about what that transfer required. A mother who had lived in Drew long enough to know both the truth and the cost of speaking it. A child who needed to learn not just what had happened, but why that knowledge was being given to her in a car, quietly rather than in a classroom or a newspaper. The lesson was not only about Emmett Till, it was about the shape of the world they were living in, about who held power in Sunflower County, about which truths were dangerous to carry and which were safe, about the specific intelligence required to survive in a place that demanded your silence as the price of your safety. Gloria Dickerson grew up carrying that intelligence. In 1965, she was among the first black students to integrate the schools in Drew. The history books used in those schools did not mention Emmett Till. In the Mississippi history textbook still used today, his murder receives 117 words, One paragraph. The barn appears nowhere. She grew up knowing something the textbooks did not say. She grew up knowing where to look when she drove down that road. She grew up understanding that there were two versions of history in the county, where she lived, the one in the books and the one in the cars, in the kitchens, in the churches, in the quiet instruction of a mother's voice, and that these two versions were not accidental. The gap between them was maintained by the same forces that had made the silence necessary in the first place. This is what the barn held for 50 years. Not just the physical fact of what had happened inside its walls, but the knowledge that certain truths could only be kept alive if the people who held them were willing to carry them without acknowledgement, without validation, without the institutional support that makes keeping a record feel like something other than a burden. The community in Drew carried the barn's truth, the way communities carry many things that official history refuses to hold, quietly, carefully, at personal cost across generations waiting. In 1981, a 10-year-old boy named Keith Beauchamp found a copy of Jet magazine in his parents' collection in Baton Rouge, Louisiana. It was the September 1955 issue, the one with the photographs of Emmett Till's body that Mamie Till Bradley had insisted on making public. Beauchamp looked at those photographs, and something fixed in him that did not loosen for the rest of his life. He grew up. He moved to New York. He made music videos during the day and researched the Till case at night, the way people pursue things that will not leave them alone. He went to Mississippi. He spent years there, not in a hurry, not with a camera or a recorder initially, just present, visiting, listening. Building the kind of trust that cannot be hurried, because it is built from the knowledge that the person asking has been there before and will be there again and is not going to disappear when the story gets difficult. Mamie Till Mobley, Emmett's mother, who by then had been speaking publicly about her son's death for nearly 50 years, took Beauchamp into her confidence. She introduced him to people. She vouched for him in the way that matters in communities that have learned to be careful. And gradually, people began to tell him things. Not everything at once. Not in depositions or formal statements. In kitchens and on porches and in the quiet of churches after the service. Pieces of a story that the community had been holding in trust, waiting for someone who seemed worth trusting with it. The barn was one of those pieces. Its location, what had happened there. Who else had been present beyond Bryant and Milam, names that Beauchamp eventually gathered and presented to the FBI when he brought his documentary to the federal government's attention in 2004. The FBI reopened the case. A grand jury was convened in LaFleur County in 2007. Beauchamp had identified, he said, at least 10 people who had been involved in the murder or its immediate aftermath and had never been investigated. The grand jury found insufficient evidence to bring charges against anyone beyond Bryant and Milam, who were by then both dead. Beauchamp refused to release the names publicly, saying he had promised confidentiality to the people who had trusted him. The case was closed again, but the barn had a location now. The official story had been corrected, at least in the historical record. The river was no longer the address of the crime. For a long time after the case was closed, the barn stood where it had always stood on the road outside Drew, weathering the wood going soft, the roof sagging in the way of structures that have not been maintained because there was no agreement about what maintaining them would mean. A man named Jeff Andrews bought the property in 1994. He learned after the purchase what the barn was. He made the decision to maintain it to allow Emmett Till's family and researchers and visitors to come there to keep it accessible to the people for whom it mattered most. He did this quietly, without press releases for 30 years. He was not rich. He was not famous. He was a private person who had come to understand that he was the steward of something that did not belong only to him. In 2022, the first public commemorative ceremony was held at the barn. Hundreds of people came from Drew, from Mississippi, from across the country. They stood in the field beside the structure that had held the truth for 50 years, while the official story looked elsewhere, and they bore witness in the way that communities bear witness when they have been waiting a long time for permission to do it openly. In November 2025, the Emmett Till Interpretive Center announced that it had purchased the barn funded by a $1.5 million donation from the writer and producer, Shonda Rhimes. The center's plans were to transform it into a sacred site, a place of memory and conscience, open to the public, part of a larger memorial landscape by the time of the 70th anniversary of the murder in 2030. My hope, Rhimes said, is that this story never gets lost. I want to say something about what it means to call a place like that a sacred site. Not to dispute the intention is clearly right, clearly necessary, clearly the kind of thing that should have happened long before it did. A place where a 14-year-old boy was killed should be marked. The people who held the truth of that place for 50 years, while the official record pointed elsewhere, deserve to have their knowledge recognized, to have the ground they drove past every day acknowledged for what it is. But there is something else, too. Something that Gloria Dickerson, who grew up in Drew, who heard her mother's voice in the car, was trying to say when she said, "For too long, people in the Delta have carried the weight of this story without the world truly seeing us." The weight she is describing is not only the weight of grief, though it is certainly that. It is the weight of a particular kind of knowledge that was dangerous to hold, that could not be shared with the institutions that were supposed to receive it, that had to be carried instead in private, in memory, in the quiet of a mother's voice, on a country road. Knowledge that was sustained across generations, not through archives or official records, but through the exact kind of transmission that official history tends to discount: oral, familial, communal, unofficial. For 50 years, the community in Drew was the archive. They were the record. They held what the Look article had erased, and the FBI had not found, and the books had not reported. They held it without recognition, without resources, without the validation that comes when the institutions that are supposed to preserve history perform that function honestly. And now the barn is being turned into a sacred site. And visitors will come, and the story will be told on interpretive panels and in guided tours, and in the language of public commemoration, which is important and real and necessary. What I find myself thinking about is the interval, the 50 years between the murder and the finding of the barn. The generations of people in Drew who carried that knowledge through decades of silence, not because they chose silence over truth, but because the cost of speaking the truth was a cost that the people asking had no right to demand they pay. Willie Reed paid it. He walked into that courtroom and he said what he knew, and he left Mississippi that night and never came back. And he lived for 58 years with what he had heard in the barn and what it had cost him to say it. He did the right thing. He paid a price that no one who did the right thing should have to pay. The others, the mothers and grandmothers and neighbors who passed the story down in cars and on porches, they were doing the right thing too, in the only form available to them. Keeping the record alive, making sure the knowledge survived, trusting that someday someone would come who was worth trusting with it. Keith Beauchamp came. It took 50 years, but he came. The barn is still standing. It is old now, the wood is gray and soft. the structure leaning slightly in the way of buildings that have absorbed a great deal of weather and time. It sits in the flat delta light, the way everything in the delta sits fully exposed, with nowhere to hide in a landscape that has always made the distance between one thing and the next feel exactly as long as it is. People drive past it on the road outside Drew. They drive past it differently now, knowing or beginning to know what it is. The marker has been placed. The purchase has been announced. The plans for 2030 are in motion. Gloria Dickerson's mother used to slow the car and turn to her daughter and say quietly, "That is where they killed Emmett Till." She said it the way you say something you want your child to carry, not as a fact only, but as a responsibility, as an instruction in how to see the world you are living in. I think about what it means that she knew, that she had always known, that the community around her had always known and had held the knowledge in the only way they safely could, and had passed it down and had waited. I think about what we ask of people when we ask them to be the keepers of a truth that the official record has decided to misplace. What it costs, what it takes from them, what it takes from their children who grow up knowing something that the history books do not say, who learn early that the distance between what happened and what is acknowledged can be measured in decades and in lives. Silence and erasure. Wright Thompson wrote are just different words for the same thing. But the silence of Drew was not the silence of forgetting. It was the silence of people who remembered everything and understood exactly why they could not yet say it. That is a different kind of silence, and it deserves a different kind of acknowledgement than the one that comes with a plaque and a guided tour, however necessary those things also are. It deserves the acknowledgement that what they carried, what Gloria Dickerson's mother carried, what Willie Reed carried out of that barn and onto that witness stand and all the way to Chicago was not a burden they should have been asked to bear alone. The barn is sacred if anything is. So is the knowledge that kept it from being forgotten.